we have bought into the cultural mindset that marriage is a partnership and that it's just two people living in existence together. And yet God says that marriage is to be a binding of two individuals becoming one flesh. And ironically, in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, Paul defines a lot of what marriage is supposed to be in a discussion about celibacy. And so he turns his attention to a question that the Corinthians have asked him. 1 Corinthians 7, starting in verse 1, he says, "Now concerning the matters about which you wrote, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman." Now the Corinthians have proposed that men should be celibate, and Paul intends to qualify and correct this. Now what we have here is a lost telephone game. Paul has written a letter to the Corinthians telling them something that has prompted this response. They've written back, and we have neither one of those letters. We've got letter number 3 of Paul writing back to the Corinthians. But we know that he wrote about a present distress, because later in the chapter, in verse 26, he says, "I think that in view of the present distress, it is good for a person to remain as he is." And this defines his discussion here in chapter 7. What this present distress is, no one is completely sure. But the two main theories is that the present distress is a severe persecution that the Corinthians are undergoing. And so he thinks that they need to remain as they are, to not really focus on physical things, to focus on staying faithful during this time of persecution. Another theory is that Paul has looked at the situation around him, and he believes the return of Jesus is imminent. He believes it's right around the corner. And so he has encouraged the Corinthians to focus on spiritual things, because in a few weeks, maybe months, the physical isn't going to matter. Regardless of what view you want to take, Paul has told the Corinthians some things that have caused them to question marriage and this act of celibacy. And so Paul wants for them to understand that within marriage there are certain obligations. So he says in verse 2, "But because of the temptation to sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife and each woman her own husband." Now remember at the end of chapter 6, he warned us to flee sexual immorality. He says every other sin you commit is outside the body, but sexual immorality is against the body. It's the sin that results in the immediate separation from God, because the spirit cannot participate in the one flesh act of being together with somebody who's not your spouse. And that the only way for a man and a woman to enjoy intimacy is within the covenant bounds of the marriage relationship created by God. So Paul is encouraging them that rather than drowning in a sea of temptation, each man and each woman should find a spouse that gives them a natural outlet for this desire. For a husband and wife, they need to understand the commitment that they're making here. Now, Paul isn't arguing that humans are incapable of controlling themselves, because Paul knows that when you get married, it doesn't solve the problem of sexual immorality. That even within marriage, both partners need to practice self-control and restraint and do what is honoring of that relationship. His primary concern is that Christians channel this desire that God has given us and the natural outlet that he's given us to have it. And so he wants for them to understand that these desires need to be fulfilled. So he says in verse 3, "The husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to her husband." See, Paul's assertion here that wives had rights within the marriage relationship, it's revolutionary. Now remember, in the first century world, women were not considered very high in the pecking order of society. Oftentimes, they were considered to just be barely above slaves. And yet Paul says, with a Christian worldview, women have rights within the marriage relationship. See, Paul, far from being the man-hater, or I guess not man-hater, woman-hater, that he's often classified to be, he elevates the status of women and tells husbands how they ought to treat the women in their life. And that God designed marriage for both partners to have their needs fulfilled. For a husband or wife to withhold conjugal rights from the other is a violation of God's creational intent in marriage. That we need to understand that there is no reason to do that. Paul is trying to get across this idea because evidently some married men are now trying to practice celibacy. And he's telling them, you can't do that. You have certain obligations, certain responsibilities in the marriage relationship, and you need to honor those. And he states the reason for these rights. Verse 4, the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. He states that neither the husband nor the wife is master of his or her own body. That the other partner is the one who has ownership of the other's body. And once again, Paul elevates the status of women here, saying that they have an equal standing in the marriage relationship with the husband, and that they ought to be honored as equal partners. Both the husband and wife are to realize that their spouse has greater claim on them than they have on themselves. Neither can claim to have authority over their own body because in the marriage relationship, they've given up that authority and handed it over to their spouse. And so Paul believes that the marriage relationship ought to be governed by the greatest example of love. That love is an attitude of service toward one another. And that husband and wife serve each other in the marriage relationship. Therefore, there isn't the abuse, there isn't the taking over and domineering, but there is a willingness to do what is in the best interest of others. Paul will go on here in his Corinthian letter, and he'll go to chapter 13 that we're all familiar with, and he will explain what love is and is not. And folks, in our marriage relationships, if we will use that as our guide, then both spouses don't have anything to fear from the other, because they are trying to do what is in the best interest of that marriage relationship. And so to withhold the rights of the other partner, or to hold them hostage, to use them to manipulate the other, once again, it's a violation of the creational intent that God wanted in marriage. Now, most modern marriages are built on a mutual ownership, are not built on a mutual ownership, one flesh concept, but on individual relationships. Now, I often hear Christian husbands say, well, my wife better not tell me what to do. Well, why not? Why not? I mean, do you not belong to her? Does her opinion not matter? Now, I've had Christian women tell me, well, that husband of mine, he better not tell me. Why? Folks, if that's the marriage that we have, we are missing out on what God intended marriage to be. No wonder we're debating what it means to have a marriage. A recent survey came out, I don't know whether you saw this, 40% of married couples don't know what the spouse makes. Don't know. They're living two completely individual lives. They might as well be roommates in the same house. That is not what God intended, of two individuals sharing an existence together, but of two individuals becoming one flesh together. If we want to speak lovingly to others about marriage, we need to accept all of God's concept Scripture teaches that it is a joining, a two becoming one. That in our marriage relationships, we ought to have our friends and neighbors not be able to speak to us without referring to our partner. Because we are so melded together, that we're so glued together, that to speak to one is to speak to the other. And that within our marriage relationships, we create an environment in which such joining is possible. You know, as long as we're going to insist on our individual rights within marriage, you're not going to get the joining that God intended for us to have. That we're not going to enjoy what it was that God wanted for us to experience in the marriage relationship. That in marriage, one gives up their right and surrenders it to the spouse. The husband does it for the wife does it for the husband. And that they work together to build a strong and lasting relationship together. It isn't something that is a disposable contract. It's not something that you can go and get rid of later and I'll find another one. But it's a joining of two individuals becoming one and becoming one flesh with each other. And with biblical love as our guide, we can create that type of atmosphere, that type of relationship. Now, Paul states that there is one exception to practicing abstinence in the marriage relationship. He says in verse 5, "Do not deprive one another, except perhaps by agreement for a limited time, that you may devote yourself to prayer, but then come together again so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control." See, abstinence in marriage should only happen under three very distinct guidelines. First, both partners have to agree to it. It can't be husband do it and wife just get the notice. Both need to agree to it. Second of all, he says it needs to be for a spiritual reason, spiritual strengthening. And third, it needs to only be for a limited time, lest Satan come and tempt them. You know, Paul once again elevates the status of women as having rights within the marriage relationship. In the ancient world, in the male-dominated society in which Paul is writing, husbands did not have to tell their wives anything. They could just make the decision, go with it, and that was it. And yet Paul very clearly says that between the husband and wife, there are to be mutual decisions made between both. That it isn't the husband going off and headstrong, and this is what we're going to do, but he consults. Why? Because she's the other half of him. You know, would you make a decision with half a brain? How many times have we done that? What do we get? We get in trouble, don't we? She's part of you. She's part of your flesh. And so you make mutual decisions together. And so he elevates the status of women as having rights within the relationship. Now, he doesn't explain why or how abstinence may aid to their prayer life. It may be that Paul is influenced by the Old Testament law, and there were certain festivals in which you were to abstain as a part of the festival, and perhaps he's making some type of connection there. But regardless, the idea is that the only reason to do this is so that you can focus on your prayer life, focus on spiritual things. But even if a couple chooses this action, he says they should get back together quickly so Satan cannot use it as an opportunity to tempt them. He understands, and it's ironic as a single guy, how powerful the drive that exists within us is. Now, I don't think I have come across a single man who has gone outside the marriage bounds who said and planned it to begin with. They always thought, well, I'm strong enough, I'm not going to do this, it's okay. Oh, you know, this relationship I got there, oh, it's just flirting, it's nothing. No. If you are one flesh with your wife, there is no room for flirting with another of the opposite sex. No room for it. Shut it down. because you honor your spouse. They're a part of you. And you don't give an opportunity for Satan to tempt you in a weak moment when you lack self-control. See, God created marriage to be the positive outlet for our desires. It's a corruption of God's intent when we withhold those rights from our spouse. It's not the way God designed marriage to be. That God designed marriage for both partners to have their needs fulfilled. I was talking to a very good friend of mine, and he goes, "Will, if I ever get tired of my wife," he goes, "I'll just move in the basement." And I said, "Well, Jack," because he didn't want to get divorced. Divorce was a bad thing. And I said, "Well, Jack, how is that fulfilling what God intended marriage to be?" God intends marriage for you guys to work it out, not for you to move in the basement because you've got an argument with her. Now, for those of us who've been married a while, marriage is a lot of work, isn't it? But there's a lot of positive benefits to it as well, isn't there? And when you work through it, what are you on the other side of that argument? Aren't you stronger? Aren't you better because of it? And because you work through it, there is a strength of character to know that when the next argument comes, when the next problem comes, it's going to be okay because we focused and we got through it before. That's the kind of commitment God is calling us to. That in becoming one flesh as God intended, neither party exercises authority over their own body. Marriage isn't about having individual existences in a group environment. You've got friends for that. Marriage is about two people becoming one, joining, melding together, and becoming like each other. Now, I knew this concept, but I did not understand that when you got married and you became older, you took on each other's characteristics, and you often swapped with one another. Things that Kelly would never do, she's now doing, and I'm the opposite now. We switch roles sometimes. But that's the wonderful thing about marriage, is that we are with one another, and we've got each other, and we're supporting one another. That we need to mutually make decisions that are in the best interest of the marriage. Not in the best interest of the husband or the wife, in the marriage. Because when we fully accept God's creational intent for marriage, we have a powerful witness of the blessing He intended for us to enjoy in this covenant relationship. Then we have the credibility to go out into the world and tell them that the definition of marriage is this: I live it, I've got it, and you want it. Then we have that opportunity. Because as long as we're giving the wink and the nod to premarital sex, we're not honoring marriage. As long as we're turning the blind eye to rampant divorce and going, well, it's just this world we live in, we're not honoring marriage. We're in the spot we're in because we forgot to honor marriage the way that it was supposed to be. We allowed culture to steep in and to kind of take over and redefine what it is. We need to get back to God's creational intent for marriage. Two people becoming one for an entire lifetime. And that's the model we uphold, that's the model we endorse, and that's the model that we celebrate among ourselves. And that we help others to understand the greatness that God intended in that relationship. I want to encourage anyone who isn't a Christian to become one with Christ, to enter into that relationship. Paul makes a very interesting argument in the book of Ephesians. He says that our union with Christ is a lot like our marriage with our spouse, two becoming one. And that we have that relationship with Him, and that we work and become stronger and deeper in it. And it becomes even more of a benefit as we grow older together with Him. I want to encourage you to have that kind of relationship with Christ. Because when when you have that kind of relationship with Christ, it makes having that relationship with your spouse a whole lot easier. Because Christ becomes your guide who helps you through those difficult times. And so we become a blessing to each other because of that. That if you've fallen away from Christ, if you've allowed your marriage or anything else to get out of whack, then make that right with God today. Don't let another moment pass. Folks, I'm afraid we're going to have to get an ark and float out of here one day. It seems like it, doesn't it? All the rain that we've had. We're not promised one more moment of life, are we? Be right with God today. Stay right with God for the rest of your life, so that when the end comes, your family can celebrate your life knowing they will see you again. If you need to respond to the invitation in any way, I want to encourage you to do that while we stand and sing.